Wonderful.
Yeah. So
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Lisa Neher. I'm a new music mezzo-soprano. I am a composer. I'm an actress. I'm a coach for composers living in Portland, Oregon. I'm proud Lewis and Clark alumni. So this is really special to me that NACUSA is being hosted by not only Cascadia Composers, our local chapter of NACUSA, but also by Lewis and Clark College. So go Pios. So the whole impetus for this presentation comes out of my work as a composer, but also really as a singer as well. Because in my life as a new music mezzo, I meet composers who have these big dreams of writing for voice, but also composers who come to me with questions like, why can't I understand the words to my own piece? Or I asked my soprano friend her range and I wrote a piece and now she's coming back and telling me that she can't sing this word on that note and what's going on there. Or maybe just a general goal, I want more choral commissions, I want more vocal performances, I want to write opera, and I want those pieces to pick up and gain popularity. How do I do that? And it really begins with digging in a little bit deep into how do we get the most out of the vocal instrument? What are some of the properties of the voice? And of how we deal with text, because whether you're setting traditionally, most people have often set lyrics or poetry or libretti, but also for those of us setting sound effect noises, syllables, those can all be broken down into similar principles to setting traditional text because they deal with the shapes of the mouth, they deal with the different kinds of sounds that are the components of words, whether you're using them as words or of sound effects. And then the other thing that I see a lot on the performer side, maybe going in and workshopping student pieces, or maybe even working with a composer who's been writing a lot but just hasn't had a chance to write for the voice too much yet, is I see things where the range isn't really working very well, or I see problems with how the piece sits in the range, particularly with where the text is placed in that range. Problems with how those syllables are being set in a range that's uncomfortable or nearly impossible to produce certain sounds. And also places where the text is set in a way that's going to make it difficult or impossible for the audience to understand what I'm saying if we're dealing with a traditional text. And I think as I've gone through talking to a lot of composers, there's a couple places where these issues stem from. One is that a lot of times in our traditional curriculum for orchestration or instrumentation, we often don't have as much time in a college curriculum always dedicated to singing as we do to some of the instrumental writing. And that goes hand in hand with a lot of the textbooks not having a lot of material there to support those professors teaching those classes. Because if you flip to those major textbooks in the voice section, you might get range, and you might get range that's different for student versus professional or choir versus soloist. And that's about it. And it's just not enough, just like it's not enough to tell someone the range of the clarinet and talk about the break registers or the chalumeau or the clarion register. It's not enough to just talk about range when it comes to singers. And so this leads to a lot of frustration when composers sit down at a piano and write a piece thinking, okay, I've got C4 to C6, go. That leads to some understandable frustration later on the composer's part, thinking, I followed all the rules. Why isn't this working? I did what the book told me to do. And then it leads to challenges for the singer being like, oh, I can't achieve this thing that I'm being asked to do, and I want to pull it off, but I feel like I'm being put in a position where it's going to be uncomfortable or dangerous. So I'm going to talk today, and in brief, each one of these topics could go into all kinds of detail, but I'm going to talk in brief about the 3 guiding principles of text setting that I think when composers bring those front and center, they help composers to prevent and fix a huge number of potentially problematic spots in their vocal composition. 1 is text stress and operative words. 2, the difference between range and tessitura. And 3, the properties of vowel and consonant sounds and how those map on to the voice and to the properties of the voice. So let's start with text stress and operative words. As we're going through, feel free to put questions in the chat, and I'm also going to watch the time like a hawk and be sure we have time for questions at the end, so we can answer things as we go if they relate directly to something I just said, or if they're more general and you just want to be sure we don't forget them, put them in the chat and I'll group some of those at the end. So don't feel shy if I don't answer your question right away. We will get to it, I promise. So there's 3 types of stress that we can talk about when we talk about how we set syllables and words to music. I'm going to use English as a common reference point for this presentation for the purposes of time. So number 1 is metric stress. How does a syllable line up with strong or weak beats or divisions of the beat? Number 2 is registral stress. How is a syllable highlighted or not highlighted by a change of register? High or low, a sudden leap versus staying kind of in the same general place by stepwise motion. And then agogic or length-based accent. How is a syllable emphasized through length, through sustain? Or how are a set of syllables maybe not sustained? Maybe they're moved through more quickly. And in English, and in many of the other common languages that I have sung in, which is not every language in the world, so I'm sure there are some exceptions to this, but in many of the classical singing languages that we study as opera singers, French, German, Italian, Spanish, these metric, registral, and agogic stress are actually already principles of the language and of the grammar of the language. So for example, in English, the stressed and unstressed syllables are an important part of understanding the very words we're saying. So we have a second syllable stress on the word about. And if I say about, it's a little harder for you to understand what I'm saying. We even have some words that are pronounced and spelled maybe identically or nearly identically, but the accent changes the meaning. So we have the word produce, fruit, and we have produce, the verb to create something. So this is often an aha moment when I work with composers who haven't had a chance to really pause and think and pull this out, because they get inspired by a poem, they start immediately to come up with wonderful, exciting, wonderful melodic ideas and just pour them out on the page. And then it can be really hard after the fact to start unwinding that and trying to realign those musical ideas with this metric stress that's already present in the language. So I really strongly suggest that you spend some time before you start putting those musical ideas on paper or on Sibelius to exploring the text that you're going to set, the lyrics you're going to write, and to exploring these stressed and unstressed syllables. And if you're ever wondering about a word, because it can be really easy to wonder, I suggest looking up in a dictionary. I like the Merriam-Webster.com because it has it does have the stressed and unstressed syllables, but it also will have the international phonetic alphabet symbols if you ever want to provide that for a singer for a less common word. And those are the phonetic symbols we're most used to reading as singers. So they're a little different maybe than the pronunciation symbols you may have learned in like grammar class, but they're the ones singers are most used to. And then you can just copy and paste, which is really nice. So scansion is this poetic system of identifying strong and weak syllables. And there's a whole bunch of things you could get into it, but we're going to keep it really simple. So I'm going to share my presentation for a second, and we're going to look at a couple lines of text and how you can start to identify these strong and weak syllables. So. All right, so I just invite you, let's mute our microphones, and I invite you to read this line of text yourself and just notice what the strong and weak syllables are. I'm not going to read it out loud because I don't want to influence you. I want you to explore it yourself. So in our poetic scansion system, we use a straight line over the top of accented syllables and a little U shape over unaccented syllables. So I've done that here. Good morning, committee. My name is Philip Spooner, and I live at 5 Graham Street in Biddeford. I am 86 years old and an active VFW chaplain. So that's how I scanned it. You might scan it slightly differently. That's fine, because you might emphasize different words. We have kind of, if we zoom in on a single word, we'll find that Webster's dictionary of the accented and unaccented syllables. But once we put it into context, maybe there's a little bit of difference of where we lean in. And that's why I really suggest that you read it aloud many times over several days, read it aloud in different ways. And that leads right into another kind of emphasis, and that comes from the theater world. This is the idea of operative words. So in the theater world, we talk about the most important words in a given sentence or in a given phrase. These are usually active words, proper nouns, verbs, like active verbs versus helping verbs, adjectives, adverbs. They're not helping verbs. They're not usually conjunctions or articles or pronouns as much, although it could be depending on the context. And for the sake of sort of challenging ourselves to be choosy, we're often asked as actors to really only choose 1 or 2 per sentence. So as you look over this scanned version of this chunk of text, I challenge you to imagine what are your operative words that you see sticking out of this text? What would you emphasize or highlight? And operative words are also really key to subtext, and they're key to meaning. So in theater, for example, I could say, I love you, or I love you. And that all implies a slightly different meaning. And that's even without me adding very much like emotion to it. So operative words are where you as a composer get to really throw your interpretation at the piece even more than the metric accent. So I'll show you how I chose operative words. These are the words that to me seemed like the most important parts of this text. You may have chosen differently, that's fine. But my cardinal rule for accented syllables, metric stress, operative words are that when these accented syllables and words line up with accented beats and divisions of the beat, and vice versa, when the unaccented syllables and words line up with unaccented beats and divisions of the beat, your vocal music will be easier to sing. It's going to be easier to put together with the rest of the ensemble, and it's going to be more clearly understood by the audience. Because what you're doing is layering the meter of your music, the metric stresses of your music, onto the pre-existing metric stresses of the words, right? And so I'll show you some examples. I made a funny example of like a what not to do small bear momentarily. But first, let's look at what Melissa Dunphy, I took this from Melissa Dunphy's Omaha Beach, and I will share that with you. Thankful to Melissa for sharing her beautiful piece with us. So here you get to see the rhythmic setting and the, in particular, that's what we're looking at this moment, of the opening of what do you think I thought for at Omaha Beach, my Melissa Dunphy. And so you see that for the most part, she does exactly this thing that I'm describing. She uses my as a pickup to name. She uses good as a pickup to morning. Okay, that's a little different than what I had, that's fine. She uses the and I as a pickups to live. She also takes the rhythm of how quickly we often tend to move through certain syllables, like here at the Biddeford. She takes some inspiration there. So she goes even deeper and actually is using the natural prosody and speech rhythms of certain words, the speed through which we move through certain syllables. So going a little bit towards that agogic stress. Let's go to the next page. This is an interesting choice. I am 86 years old. That's like an interpretive choice. That's not how I had it scanned, but it, so it shows you that there's some, there's definitely a lot of room for different choices in this. But for the most part, across even very syncopated pop music and musical theater music, I find that it's very clear when composers know the underlying metric stress and are being sensitive to it and using it a lot of the time, and when there's absolutely no sense that that is on their mind. And she does change time signatures, and this is something I really suggest for composers. She changes the meter signatures to allow those strong beats to line up with strong syllables. So if she kept this in 4/4 the whole time, pretty quickly we would be in a place where now Biddeford would be on the downbeat, right? I don't know, I'm getting mixed up already. Maybe 80 or 6 would be on the downbeat. Things would start to shift and it becomes much more difficult to sing. So sometimes composers will tell me that they're a little nervous about changing time signatures. But if the time signatures are going to reflect actually how those stresses sound, I strongly suggest it. Okay. So that was metric and a little bit of a agogic accent. Let me grab my notes here. Operative words. Oh yeah, registral accent. We'll talk about that in a moment. All right, now for one of my favorite activities. We are going to sing Mary's Strange Little Lamb. Drew knows this one. Okay, so as a way to help you understand what happens when composers maybe don't align their words like this, we're going to attempt to sing Mary Had a Little Lamb beginning on beat 4 instead of beginning on beat 1. And so I'm going to encourage you, I hope, is everyone muted except me? Otherwise we'll really confuse each other. Okay, so I'm going to encourage you to clap or conduct and try really hard to stay true to what is written and just notice what happens in your brain and in your mind. We'll do it like down here. Mary. 1, 2, 3. Oh, I need to double time my conducting. 1, 2, 3. Mary had a little lamb, little lamb, little lamb. Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow. Okay, so if you were able to get all the way to the end without starting to get a little confused, good for you. It's not how the music sounds. It's not barred right at all, at all, at all. Under no circumstances is this barred correctly. And so when you're going back through and editing a piece of vocal music, it's really a great idea to do some of this singing or speaking in rhythm and interrogate a little bit for yourself where those bar lines are. What have I got next? Aha! So here's a great example of I took a piece of mine and I did everything possibly wrong. Okay, so again, if this is an unaccompanied piece, if the very first thing the singer sings is on the second 16th note, it will sound like the downbeat. There's absolutely no way with no context that this will not sound like a downbeat. Okay, to slide here to an accent on the second quintuplet, again, there's no way that's not going to sound like the downbeat or like a beat. With no context, there's no way. It's just making your singer work way too hard. Okay, how about here where not is on the and? 1, 2, they're not gonna let me play in the US Open. Maybe that's a cool syncopated lick, but equally likely as it is not really accurately describing how the music is going to sound. And again, it's gonna make your singer work really hard for zero payback. Here's an example of a metric accent, the highest note of the phrase, or I'm sorry, not a metric, a registral accent, okay? It's not open, it's open, right? So not only is the accent lining up the unaccented syllable on the beat, it's also getting a registral accent, the highest note of the phrase, to, again, an unimportant syllable. This will make it really hard for the audience to understand what is being said. It's worth saying it's also hard for ensemble, especially your very skilled collaborative pianists are used to listening for those downbeats, reading the vocal line, and they're really sensitive to the text. They often practice and sing the text. And so there's no way when these things start to sound like a beat but aren't, that's not going to get in the way of the ensemble, because they have to listen against what the music sounds like and how the music reads. And so it causes a lot of challenges in coordinating the ensemble and a lot more rehearsal time. If this was the cool syncopated lick, then making it really clear with maybe an accent on pen, and maybe even put it on the downbeat, so at least it's easier to line up, because it's going to feel like a really strong beat the way it's set. Here, we'll get into this in a moment. This is all just set way too high. This text at the bottom, this is way too high for text, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Here's another there strange, bad agogic length accent. So there's a fun example. And then here's actually what I wrote. Okay. So now we have registral and agogic length accent happening on the downbeat of the 3/4, emphasizing the what. I do have the agogic accent happening here on open, but it's on the and of beat 2. So, some people might say they don't like that. That's fine. They can have a different opinion. What else did I want to say in this? Nope, that's all. They're not going to let me play in the US Open. They're scared I'll beat half the men. They're scared I'll beat half of the men. So the rhythms line up a lot closer to how I hear the words. Great. Okay. Aha, cool. I'm going to show you one more. I stopped my share too soon. So I did want to show some cool syncopation and how both the agogic accent can kind of soften the syncopation, and also how even in a syncopated line, there's still going to be attentiveness to natural speech stress. So in Thoroughly Modern Millie, this is a musical theater piece by Tessitura. We have the syncopated no, and it's slightly softened or made more intelligible because of the agogic accent. And then the next word, canary, is set with attention to lining up the natural speech stresses rhythmically. No canary in a cage. Again, in, not an important word, landing on the downbeat. Also not an important word, being lengthened by the agogic accent. And then cage, getting some emphasis because it's lengthened. No canary in a cage for me. And then me landing. And then again, free with the registral accent as well. So these are all tools in the toolbox. There's no never ever do, right? Just it's music, it's art. But you can see how even in a very syncopated song, there's sensitivity to these ideas. All right. Oh, thank you, Jeff, for that compliment. That is very sweet. All right, let's talk about range and tessitura. So range versus tessitura, this is another thing that is really important to keep in mind when writing for singers. So the range of a piece is the distance from the lowest note to the highest note in a given piece, or the distance from the lowest note to the highest voice that a voice is singing as their public kind of professional range. The tessitura is the zone where most of those notes lie, if we're talking about a piece of music, or it's the zone where the singer would like to be for most of the notes, or would like to continue to gravitate back to throughout the piece, the least taxing zone. So here's an example. The range of these two examples is the same, but one is a high tessitura, kind of hovering at the top. One is a low tessitura. Okay, so your altos and baritones are not going to love this tessitura so much. You know, your tenors and sopranos are going to be more comfortable potentially. And likewise, actually singing in a lower tessitura than is ideal can sometimes be fatiguing for the singers who prefer to sing in the upper register, for your tenors and sopranos. So it's really important when you're talking to singers to ask them about their preferred range and preferred tessitura. Here's another great way to understand range and tessitura, is to look at the different keys of some of the great art song composers like Franz Schubert. So here's On die Musik in the high key, okay? C sharp to F sharp. And then here is On die Musik in the low key, A3 to D5. And I love to look at art song because art song tends to have a more moderate range. This is advantageous in many ways. One, because most likely your piece isn't going to be just programmed on a concert where the singer only sings one thing. So they're going to have to sing some other stuff. So it's great not to wear them out completely on just one song. Also, when you write in a more moderate range, you have more options for doing transpositions without getting into like a really thorny key. You know, if you have to like exactly move it down only a minor third precisely to get to that next common voice type, maybe that's going to be difficult for your piano, or maybe that's going to be a really thorny for your string players. And so it gives you more play, you know, if you have a little bit more moderate range. And then just as an example, here's this is a very overview. There's going to be variations, but an overview of like a professional soprano all the way to more a high school or choral soprano. So you can see that, you know, some professional sopranos are going to have the high F, maybe even, the high F, or maybe even beyond if they're a coloratura. They may need to sing that low G in an occasional aria. Mozart often brings his sopranos down. They don't love it always down there, okay? The sort of standard professional range to where, you know, if you don't have the low C to the high C, you're not quite ready to sing as a professional soprano yet. You're going to have that. And then the practical range where like most of those notes should lie, or if you're writing for sort of an undergrad, rising undergrad, early master student, a lot of the notes, that D to A. The high schooler, you know, might be sort of somewhere in between. And then the tessitura for most sopranos, right in the staff. And that harkens back to, you know, where do these clefs come from? We had the soprano clef, the alto clef, the tenor clef, you know, we had all the different clefs. And now mostly singers just read soprano and bass clef, or I'm sorry, treble and bass clef, right? But they were designed so that most of the notes would fit on that staff. And so I encourage you to keep that in mind as well as you're writing, especially for what we're going to talk about next, which is how do the different sounds we make map onto this range and tessitura. Okay. So I'm going to stop the share for a second. So a property of the voice is that we have to open our mouths taller to hit higher notes. All voices must open up taller towards more of an ah or an shape. We just need that space to hit the sound acoustically from a physics of sound perspective. So this has a big implication when we talk about text, because every vowel or consonant is a different shape in the mouth. So your instrument is changing constantly for any text that you're singing, sometimes in a single syllable even. So I'm going to invite you to speak the words in this vowel chart that I'm going to put back on the screen slowly, and just experience what goes on in your mouth for the different vowels in English. Which vowels have more closure in terms of the lips, the tongue, the teeth being closer together, which have less going on in the mouth, which have a more relaxed jaw, relaxed tongue, and then we'll talk about it. All right. So see, sit, boot, book. These are our closed vowels. That means that the tongue is in a more elevated position or the lips are more rounded compared to others. Medium vowels, A like potato, met, eh. The O of potato, if you sort of say it like someone from Minnesota, we don't often say the pure O so much in most of our American dialects. Potato. The of about, those are our medium vowels. A little bit of activation of the lips or the tongue, but not as much as in the closed vowels. So if you compare E of C to A of potato, E, A, notice your tongue goes from a slight sit up to a little bit lower, still activated. Or ooh, oh, ooh, oh, ooh, oh, ooh to O, the lips open more. That's really almost the only difference between the oo and the O vowel. Our open vowels, ah like father, ah like alligator. It's a little hard to find the open O depending on your dialect. I like the word or. It's a little hard to isolate depending on where you grew up. As in other. These have very little going on in the mouth. Has a little bit of tongue. And have almost no tongue activation and a very neutral lip position. If you compare the open O of or to the closed O of the Minnesotan potato, O, it's more open lips. Again, it depends a little on dialect. And then we have our diphthongs. Diphthongs are two vowel sounds in a single syllable where we glide between them, and we have a lot of these in English. And so these are really important to be aware of because often, again, where it's English, it's not always spelled the way it sounds, right? Or it's not always spelled the way it sounds. So it can be really deceptive. So it's very helpful to look these things up in the dictionary and also to say them. I of sky is a glide from A to E. A of say is a glide from A to E. O is a glide from O to oo. Blow. We have a lot of O's. Oh, we almost never say the pure O, depending on where you grew up in the US. Oi, as in toy. Question in the chat. Yeah, Jeff, it really depends on the or. People will have different examples of open O. If you sing it all, you can think of the open O as the Latin domine. It's literally O with a little bit more height. It's a little hard to isolate in English. Find one that works for you, as a touch point. Some people like aw, like ought, but depending on your dialect, you might actually say that more like a dark version of ah. So it just depends on what you prefer, as a touchstone. So when you're looking at your text, I highly suggest that you underline and do your scansion, right? Accented and unaccented syllables, that you identify those operative words, that you speak your text a lot and think about those syllables. And also that you speak your text in front of a mirror and really ask yourself, where are those open vowels? Because it is super easy to get excited and write a really exciting, wonderful vocal line that ends up with an E on a very high note. And these two things are not going to really work well together. So what the singers need to do is open those mouths taller, which means that the open vowels are your friends for high notes. If we have to sing an E or an A up high, we have some choices we have to make. We try to open our mouth as much as we can to hit the note beautifully, but we know we're going to lose some intelligibility. If we don't open it enough, because we really want to be intelligible, we risk squeaking, not hitting it, being a little flat, maybe kind of cracking and being uncomfortable and messing up the rest of our singing for the song until we can kind of take a break from that vocal kind of whack that we just took. And if you are, a singer who really cares about getting the text across, which is all of us, that is why we're all in this, it's a really stressful thing because we're torn between wanting to express your beautiful music and express the text and the words to the audience, and of course wanting to make our beautiful in-tune sound that we will also be criticized if we don't make, and that we also care about because it's our expression of ourselves. So I also encourage you to identify those words that you're thinking about would be super duper dramatic and awesome, and ask yourself, what can you do to set those in a range where they will be successful? And what we find is if we look to the standard rep, right, to the composers who were writing when this style of singing was coming to be, they tend to do this very thing, that they use open vowels on the high notes. They use open vowels and melismas for the vocal fireworks for the long melismas. Let's take a look at, for example, the Queen of the Night aria. Okay, so you probably know this from Magic Flute. The word is banda, and she sings, she's going to take the N and she's going to put it all the way down here before the D, and she's going to sing this all on ah. And in fact, as she goes up high, she's going to modify that ah towards an ah or whatever open gigantic space she needs to sing those high notes, and no one will care because she sounds like $1,000,000. And the audience will get to hear the consonants down in the staff where they can be more easily understood, because every consonant is a closure of the mouth space. It is an interruption of the vocal tract in some way to create a percussive sound. So consonants are also things we have to really look out for most of the time in the standard rep. When we have our high notes, we are leaping up to them on a vowel, often on a melisma, and we are resolving them down and putting those final consonants back in the staff. When a bunch of text is set above the staff, it is very difficult to be understood because we have to keep closing our mouths, and this disrupts the sound waves that we're trying to make. And at the same time, we're trying to open our mouths as much as possible, which can distort the very vowels and consonant sounds that we need to make to be understood. So here's another example from the standard rep. This is the Une voce poco fa from Rossini's Barbara of Seville. So here, not quite as high, but you can see that we're leaping up to the high note. We've got all this text here in the staff, fantastic. The ah vowel on the high note, she's gonna have to do the D and the R. She can handle it. And again, the high note leaping up to the ah, to the o, more open vowels there for your mezzo. Okay. Oh, great. So a good rule of thumb to keep in mind for most singers who sing in the treble clef, which is most of your sopranos, mezzos, and tenors, is that diction above the staff, G and up, or maybe even F and up for some of your mezzos, especially if they're younger, if you want to write for undergrads. Minimize the number of words they have to say up there. Open vowels are going to be your friends, delivering more of the text in the staff. For your basses and baritones, it can vary a bit. Maybe E above middle C might be about as high as you want to do too much text for your baritones. C or D for your basses. There's exceptions to every rule. The lighter the voice, the coloratura sopranos, the leggero tenors, they're going to have more flexibility, sometimes more clarity because of the lighter sound. They have a little bit more dexterity up there. So talk to your singer, but in general, if you can think a little bit more on the conservative side when you're setting the text and set your high notes on those open vowels, on those melismas, on repeated text, or if you're using sounds in isolation as vocalises, as sound effect noises, if you can plan that those open sound effect noises are going to be on more open sounds, things that relate to the ah and o, say those syllables to yourself, make those noises, get super goofy, and ask yourself, okay, where do I want to put that? If I want a whole bunch of, maybe a consonant noise repeated, chicka, chicka, chicka or something, is that going to be super effective up on that high A? Probably not, but down low, not a problem. So the consonant sounds, the closed vowels and medium vowels, or getting a lot of text out, that's going to be more intelligible lower down in the range or in the sort of main tessitura of the voice. And then letting those fireworks be on those open vowels will be more understood. So that's a lot of stuff, but those are my big takeaway points for this talk. This is what I love to work on with composers, so it's super fun for me to talk about. What questions do you have for me? Nobody has any questions. Everyone's an expert now. Great.
I have a
So
question.
Lisa, I was going to
Yeah.
say, if you haven't, I was going to make a comment, but maybe if you want to ask a question, maybe I should let you go first, Andrew.
No, why don't you go first? Because
Oh,
the dogs are about to go for because they're making a lot of noise. So you
okay.
talk.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Yeah, very enjoyable and informative. And I just wanted to kind of underscore a point that you made that I thought was really well articulated, which had to do with the way you set in your song U.S. Open,
Mm.
because you have there an example of a word like open that has an unstressed syllable, pen.
Mm-hmm.
And you have a long note on that pen, but the key that makes it totally different than just doing that out of the blue without any previous context is you have those two bars of clear 4/4, and that's really articulated through a pattern, through
Mm-hmm.
a repeated pattern. So if you're not looking at the score, and you would still come away with a sense of the clear 4/4 meter, and then feel that as a syncopation when you get to the syllable pen. So
Mm-hmm.
anyway, I thought that was a great example of
Oh,
where
good.
you can get away with a long syllable, but it's in a context that makes it make perfect sense. So
Absolutely. And I actually do find that for English and for the other like very unaccented kind of metric languages that I've studied, which would be Spanish, German, and Italian, speaking for those, that a Gogic accent syncopated, if it's setting a if we're using a Gogic accent on an unaccented syllable, if the unaccented syllable lines on a non-accented beat, we understand it pretty darn well. Trailing unaccented syllables rarely mess up the audience's understanding in these highly metric languages, because I think, as far as I can understand it, I'm not a linguist, but I play one on TV. I play it on the opposite. The meter is that stress unstressed is first and foremost for English, Spanish, Italian, German, in how we understand, and we really can continue to get that information even if something is extended. Thanks, Elizabeth. Great to have you. Wonderful. Yeah. Other questions for me? And it could be, it doesn't have to be about this either. If you've got some other voice, I mean, I'm here. So if it's about writing for voice, feel free to throw it at me. Oh, I'm so glad. Thank you. The books, it's tricky because there's not a lot of good books about it. So yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say is there is a book, Sharon Mabry, Exploring 20th and 21st Century Vocal Repertoire. This is geared towards singers. I would recommend checking it out at the library first. It's not super expensive, but this is a little more about extended techniques and how to write them and how to produce them, which I think is very useful for composers to read about. It's sort of a how-to guide for singers. The other thing I guess I would say is like follow me on socials. Are you on social media, Andrew? Because I post about this stuff all the time. And then like email me and let's chat, because I'm glad it was useful, and this is kind of my jam. Is I mean, it's selfishly motivated. I love singing new music, and I'm also a composer who loves to write for singers. So I want all the composers in the world to know all this cool stuff. And I get it. I get it if it doesn't come easily to composers. I never played a stringed instrument ever. And I can't tell you the number of hours I spent in Michael's office, in my other composition teacher's office, being like, wait, what? There's two ways to play the same note. What are you talking about? It was so new to me. So, I can see how teachers have explained these to me, how I go back to the textbooks and like, oh yeah, they're writing about the stretches for, between the frets. Well, they're not the frets, but between the positions. And those explanations have really helped me. So that's what I dream of doing for writing for singers.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's helpful.
That's really interesting, Jeff. So there's kind of some different things going on down in the low range. Some of your singers are going to prefer more bright forward vowels. So we didn't talk about bright versus dark, but your bright vowels are the ones that they're actually we've measured where they resonate in the skull, and they vibrate farther forward. So e, a, I. The darker vowels, oo, o, these vibrate a little farther back, and people can get into the weeds even more, but that's kind of an overview. Many singers will prefer the more forward vowels. That said, oddly enough, acoustically, although ah is great up high, it also has some interesting physics of sound things where it is also the most conducive chest voice vowel is ah, through a different thing than the needs of the opening. Ah is more aligned in terms of the formant tuning, which is a fancy way of saying some of the other harmonic things going on in the color and the timbre of that. So I tend to suggest, oh yeah, thanks, Greg. The Composing for Voice by Rutledge. That one's out there. I suggest with the low notes, unless you know your singer and that they love to sit down there, that you dip down and come back up. That you treat those low notes as sort of the reverse. For the high notes, we jump up and resolve down. For the low notes, dip down and come back up. A voice that might get very tired from sitting on, let's say you shove that soprano on the low A, could very easily sing it kind of in a parlando or a recitative like way where they dip down and come back up with no problem. But if you set a bunch of repeated, and I know how cool it is as a composer to sit on a note and like chant and do these cool effects, but like that lowest note of the range is not the note to do it on. Like go up a third. Put your soprano on a D or an E and have her do that. She'll actually be able to give you way more color options, and it will still sound very low. And it seems like cheating because it's not the bottom note. But it's not cheating. It's actually putting it in a place where she has a lot of flexibility. I'm saying she, that's kind of gendered, I'm sorry, where a soprano has a lot of flexibility. Somebody who's used to singing that range. And, there are going to be exceptions to that. There's going to be the person with the really awesome wild extension. And when you have that person, feel free to write for them. And then please write some Ossia notes for the rest of us. Or actually, I'll have you reverse that. Please write your awesome notes for your person with the cool extension, and then make those the Ossia tiny notes and write the higher notes for the rest of us. Because the rest of us will look at your piece, and if the higher notes are Ossias, we will think, no, that's cheating. I don't want to do the piece and let the composer down. And you won't get a performance. But if you write the low notes as an Ossia, then the rest of us will go, oh, I don't have those, but that's okay. I'll sing what's written. And the person who does will be like, sweet, I'm going to show off my low notes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. The contemporary choral arranging. Yeah, thank you, Greg. Thanks for sharing those resources. Yeah, you're so welcome. It's really helpful. I think as composers, we have our psychology, of being maybe afraid of writing the wrong thing, or afraid of writing something so easy it's boring, or afraid of writing something so hard no one will do it. And on the flip side, I know this being a performer with many performer friends, on the performer side, performers don't want to take on something they can't rock. And they really, really respect you. And even if you maybe are like an emerging composer who feels like, oh, I have so much to learn, wouldn't someone just please anyone perform my music? That is not how this performer looks at it. They go, can I rock this or can I not? And, when they see that one low note that some sopranos have or that some basses have but that they don't have, they'll go, well, that's it. I can't do the piece. I really like it, but I wouldn't dare let them down. And it can feel really embarrassing to ask for an alternate high note. It can feel, especially when it's your body, no one can say to the bassoon, please add another note on the bottom, but the voice isn't like that, And we all know of these amazing people who have the extra things, right? And we're not the person that has that extra note. I know plenty of sopranos who are like, I don't really like to sing the high D, and I feel like that high C somehow isn't good enough anymore. So it's kind of good to know the psychology, of everybody involved. Any other questions for me about writing for singers or?
I think it was a terrific presentation, Lisa. I
Oh, thank
greatly
you.
appreciate it. Thank you very much.
You're
It was
so welcome.
actually very helpful.
Oh, I'm so glad. Yay, that's what I aim to do. So I appreciate
Agreed.
that. Thanks, John.
Agreed.
Nice to meet
It
you.
was very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Now I know
Thanks.
why all the singers yell at me. I thought they were just being stubborn.
No, that's okay.
Wonderful.
Now-
Lisa, enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest
Yeah.
of the conference.
Thank you. You too. Take care.
Yeah, take care.
All right. Bye-bye then.
Bye.